I would preach on that gospel, but it's a sermon in itself already. So I'm turning my eyes, is the recording started? Okay. So I'm turning my eyes back to the Old Testament lesson today because I think it has a lot of wealth to be mined. So let me start with a story about this reading. A long, long time ago, in a land far, far away, the Hebrews had conquered this land called Canaan, and now it is called Israel. And the land was ruled by separate tribes, each with their own autonomous regions. But every once in a while, when an enemy rose up against Israel, the tribes would raise up a leader called a judge, and that judge would pray to God, figure out what to do, and defend Israel from its enemies. Now, the Israelites looked to other nations and saw that they had kings. And they're like, well, you know, they have standing armies. This is great. Like, we got this weird judge system where we can't seem to, you know, every time we have an enemy, we have to figure out what to do and raise an army. Wouldn't it be nice to have an army already? And so they went to God and they said, we want a king just like the other nations. And God said, no kings. And they're like, no, God, we want kings. We look at them. They are ready for defense. They're ready to go. And God said, look, this is what will happen if you have a king. They will tax you heavily. They will take your women in as concubines. They will take your men to war. And they will conscript your labor for their projects. So Israel, no kings. But the people really wanted a king. They wanted to be as powerful as the other nations. So they begged and begged and begged, and then God got tired of them and said, okay, you want kings? Fine. I'll give you your kings. You'll be sorry. And they were. Because as soon as they got kings, the kings got a little lightheaded with their power and started breaching the confines of their power, beginning with the first king, Saul. He looked like he was going to be pretty good. Very successful military campaigns in the beginning, expanding the boundaries of Israel. But he thought, well, I'm the king. I can do whatever I want. And I'm going to start doing sacrifices. I'm going to do the priestly part and the monarchy part. And God was not happy with this. So he sent his prophet, Samuel, to tell Saul, you're out of a job. And so we enter the story today in the reading when Samuel is told to go find the next king, David. One of the trends in the Old Testament is that we know about kings, and we know that kings for a long time were in this pattern, constant pattern of becoming corrupt, of leading the people into apostasy by worshiping idols, and also by sequestering wealth among the wealthy and leaving the poor uncared for. So those were the two big problems with the kings. They were leading the people to worship anything but Yahweh, and then they were unjust and not caring for the people of God. So almost every king was a terrible king. There are very few good kings. God knew this was going to happen. So one of the things people don't see often when they read the Old Testament is that at the same time there's a rise in monarchy, there was the rise of the prophets. Every king had their prophet, and the prophet was the accuser, the protestor, and the conscience of the king. So God and the prophet work together to corral the ego of the king, to put them on a path where their power doesn't bleed everywhere. And so prophets and monarchy were always side by side in this time in which Israel had kings. So sometimes I hear a phrase people use to me that they don't like the Old Testament because, the Old Testament God was so violent. And there's some truth to that if you only read most of the Old Testament. So the history is very brutal. God, in a large part of the Old Testament, sanctions genocide, sanctions all kinds of torture and all kinds of things under the auspices of the conquest of Canaan and the kings. But there's, thank God, another part of the Old Testament that we all really must read, because what they are is an argument against this larger body of work. So this larger body of work is from what we call the perspective of the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomistic history. I used to sing this when I was in my Old Testament class. Deuteronomistic, And it's because that helped me remember that it was the kind of the antithesis of that upbeat thing. So the Deuteronomistic historian, almost all the Bible is written post-exilic, meaning there were several exiles, but most of the writing really started after the Babylonian exile or during the exile in Babylon. And the big question of that time, why they were writing, they were asking this question: why is this happening to us? Why are we here in Babylon? Why have we watched our kin and our country folk be tortured, our wealth stolen, our land stolen? Why are we here? And the Deuteronomistic historian had a very clear and pat answer. We're here because we sinned. That is from the lens of a traumatized person, traumatized worldview. We are here because we sinned. And so they wrote backwards in a way, right, to explain why they ended up in Babylon, why they were suffering. And it's because they sinned. And the Deuteronomistic historian points out two things they think happened. The kings led us into apostasy, worshiping any other god but Yahweh. And second, because of the rulers, the leaders, creating an economy of great disparity in which the rich had everything and the poor had nothing, this deep injustice. This is why God has ruined us. So that's the main body of the literature. But then you have this other argument against or questioning this very clear answer. And some of the questions are we all know Job, right? And we actually hear some of that perspective in today's reading in The Man Born Blind, right? Why was he blind? Oh, because he sinned, right? Like that's a leftover, right? Continues to go through. And then there are some people who are like, well, I don't know if that's always true. And Job was clearly that, right? And all his friends, when he had lost his family and his wealth and everything, all his friends are like, well, because you sinned, Job. And Job's like, I didn't. I really didn't. And they're like, no, you did. You did. Because why else would this happen to you? And at the end of the book of Job, we hear God saying, Job didn't sin. But I'm not going to tell you why this happened, because we're left with a question more than an answer. There are other books in the Old Testament, like the book of Ruth and the book of Jonah, and even 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a very different representation of history than Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. For one, in 1st and 2nd Chronicle, David is not as good looking because they didn't really care for David. Right. So it's, even though the larger portion of the Old Testament has this clear-cut answer of why bad things happen to people and this kind of very merciless appeal to, well, it's because we sinned. Other answers is we don't know why this happens. We don't know. Or there's some other material like, well, someone else is to blame besides us. There's other perspectives on what it means to live in exile. Like, well, instead of constantly saying we want to go back and we mourn, let's just make the best of it here. And some people did. They made life in exile and raised their families, and they became the diaspora, right? The diaspora that we hear on Pentecost. So in many ways, the Bible is an argument with itself, and it's important to recognize that in as much as you don't like certain parts, there are other parts that are really interesting as an argument to just kind of figure out where you stand, what you think, and what the community thinks. So going back to this thing in which God says no kings, and we have sometimes this conversation in church like, is it okay to do politics in church? And well, let me tell you that if you are calling yourself a prophet, and you feel prophetic, you feel this burning in your gut when things happen in our world, know that you are, one, part of a long tradition of protest and resistance, but also remember that the prophets were they were a difficult bunch themselves. So what do we do with our engagement with the powers that be? So I'm going to say that among the prophets, there were a segment of the prophets, and if you've been taking Lou's class on Wednesdays, you would know that some of the prophets said really important things besides condemnations. They looked toward a future of justice, a future of peace. And that, I think, is the part of this tradition that we can take and really think about. What would it mean to be prophetic, knowing that part of the job is to announce good news? To announce good news. And part of that is the future of peace, the future of justice. And a third thing I want to say is, if you feel prophetic, the one thing I really encourage you is to look at those prophets who prayed and prayed and prayed before they went into their protest and their resistance. And it was because they first prayed for people everywhere, in places of hardship. And it was because they loved their people. So that, I think, is a prophetic way of being in this world. Pray, love, stand for the truth. Amen.